I handed my siblings the keys to our family's business while they shook hands with their lawyer and smiled like they'd already won. My own lawyer sat beside me, shoulders tight, jaw clenched. He'd spent 4 months preparing for a fight I'd just refused to finish. The notary asked if I understood what I was signing. Yes, I said, and I meant it. That was the moment everyone in that room believed the story was over. They were wrong. It was only just beginning. The letter arrived on a Thursday in early November, tucked between a hydro bill and a flyer for a Boxing Day sale that hadn't started yet. I remember because Thursdays were my long days. I opened the shop at 7 and rarely left before 6. I'd been doing that for 3 years by then, ever since my parents' health made it impossible for them to keep up with the demands of running a small business in a town that doesn't slow down for anyone. I opened the envelope at the kitchen table, still wearing my coat. The language was formal, distant, the kind that makes ordinary devastation sound procedural. My brother and sister were suing me for full ownership of Belair Home Goods, the family business my parents had built over 30 years in Barrie, Ontario. They claimed the transfer of the business into my name had been made under duress. They said our parents hadn't understood what they were signing. They said I had manipulated a situation to my own benefit. I read it twice. Then I set it down and looked at the window above the sink where my mother used to keep a small pot of rosemary on the sill. It wasn't there anymore. She'd moved it to her apartment when my parents relocated to a smaller place 2 years ago, after the business became too much for them to manage. After I'd stepped in to manage it for them, the business wasn't glamorous. Belair Home Goods sold quality kitchen and home accessories, the kind of things people in small towns drive 40 minutes to buy rather than order online. My parents had built its reputation on knowing their customers by name, on sourcing from Canadian suppliers where they could, on being the kind of store that remembered you'd mentioned your daughter was getting married and pulled something aside for you. That reputation didn't maintain itself. It required presence, consistency, and someone willing to put in the hours without being asked. I had done all of that quietly, without announcement, the way I'd been raised to help. When my father's heart condition made early mornings difficult and my mother's mobility started declining, I started covering more shifts. Then managing inventory. Then handling supplier relationships and the quarterly HST remittances and the payroll for the 2 part-time staff we kept year-round. Eventually, my parents suggested we transfer the business formally into my name. It would make things simpler, my father said. Protect the business from any complications if something happened to either of them. We sat in a lawyer's office on a Tuesday afternoon, all 4 of us, my parents, my brother Marcus, my sister Dana, and me. The transfer was explained carefully. Everyone was present. My parents asked questions. They signed willingly. Marcus had moved to Calgary 3 years earlier for a tech job that paid him well and kept him far from anything that required inconvenience. Dana lived 40 minutes away in Aurelia and visited on holidays and occasionally when she needed something. Neither of them had worked a shift at the shop in years. Neither had attended a single supplier meeting, written a check for a repair, or sat across from an accountant or 20 explain why a profitable quarter still felt tight on cash flow. None of that appeared in their legal filing. I called a lawyer the following morning. Her office was above a dentist's office near the waterfront, and she had the kind of calm that comes from having seen worse. She reviewed the documents, asked good questions, and leveled with me. They don't have much of a legal foundation, she said. The transfer was properly executed, witnessed, notarized. Your parents were represented. She paused. But family cases rarely live and die on the law alone. Courts look at context, at relationships, and these things cost everyone involved. She was right about that last part. The first procedural hearing was unremarkable. Dates were set, motions filed. Marcus flew in from Calgary and sat beside Dana in matching expressions of quiet confidence. My parents weren't present. They had submitted statements through their own separate counsel, which is how I learned they had hired their own lawyer. Not to oppose the case, but to clarify their position. Their position, as it turned out, had shifted since November. That was its own particular hurt, separate from the lawsuit itself. My parents had not called me, had not asked what I remembered, had simply signed documents prepared by someone else that suggested the original transfer might have been, in their words, emotionally pressured. I lay awake most of that week, not rehearsing arguments, just remembering. The Saturday I drove my father to emergency at Royal Victoria because he was having chest pain and then went directly to open the shop afterward because it was the first weekend of December and we couldn't afford to miss it. The summer I skipped a friend's wedding in Prince Edward Island because a major supplier had a problem with a shipment, and I was the only one who knew the account details. The filing cabinet I reorganized, the insurance policy I caught had lapsed, the flooding in the storage room I handled alone on a Tuesday night in April while the rest of my family slept. None of it had been done to gain ownership. It had been done because someone had to do it and I was there. My lawyer grew more insistent as the months moved forward. She called me on a Sunday once, which told me something about where her head was. "You have documentation for everything," she said. "Bank records, correspondence, supplier contracts in your name. If we bring this to trial, we will win, and we will win clearly." I heard her. I understood the logic. And still, something in me would not settle around the idea of using all of that against my own family in a courtroom. The depositions were worse than I'd anticipated. Sitting in a small room with a court reporter while Marcus's lawyer asked me to characterize my own motivations felt like being asked to explain the color of water. Every decision I'd made over 3 years was reframed as strategy. My involvement recast as takeover. My father's trust repositioned as vulnerability that I had exploited. When I heard Marcus describe me as calculating, I felt something in my chest close off. Not with anger, with finality. I stopped trying to explain myself in my own mind. I started, instead, to look at the actual documents. What I found there was not a surprise to me. It was a surprise to everyone else. The business had obligations attached to it that predated my involvement. Supplier agreements with long-standing terms that required active management and renewal. A commercial lease with a personal guarantee clause that had transferred with ownership. A deferred maintenance schedule that the previous property manager had flagged and that my parents had managed for years, then quietly handed to me along with everything else. There were also provincial and federal tax obligations related to the business structure, HST remittance schedules, employee deductions, the kind of administrative backbone that keeps a small business compliant and that most people never think about until it collapses. I had been managing all of it. I had the records to prove it. And none of it disappeared just because a deed changed hands. The night before the final hearing, my lawyer sat across from me in her office with a cup of tea she hadn't touched. "I'm asking you one more time," she said. "Let me do what I've prepared to do. We can protect you completely." I shook my head. "Let them have it," I said. She looked at me the way people look at someone they think has made a mistake. They'll only understand later. "I want it on record," she said, "that I advised against this." "It's on record," I told her. I slept better that night than I had in months. The hearing room was smaller than people imagine. Wood paneling, fluorescent lighting, the low hum of a building that processes conflict on a schedule. Marcus and Dana sat with their lawyer, posture easy, voices measured. Their lawyer spoke with the confidence of someone who had won before getting there. My lawyer spoke carefully, precisely, the way someone speaks when they disagree with their client but respect the decision. When the documents were placed in front of me, I signed them without hesitation. One page, then the next. Across the table, Marcus allowed himself a small nod. Dana exhaled. Their lawyer was already reaching for his briefcase. Then he stopped. It started as a pause, a small one. He had flipped back to the attachment pages, the ones that outlined the transferred obligations, the supplier agreements, the personal guarantee on the commercial lease, the deferred maintenance liabilities, the administrative schedules. His posture changed first, shoulders drawing in, then his color. The judge noticed. "Is there an issue, counsel?" A half-second delay before the answer. "No, Your Honor, just reviewing the full scope." But his face said otherwise. And my lawyer, who had spent 4 months preparing to fight, looked at him, then at me, and said nothing. She had understood. The hearing ended without further comment. The decision was finalized. The business was transferred. Marcus was already talking about what changes he wanted to make. He'd mentioned it once in a hallway, something about modernizing the inventory system, bringing in a broader product line. He spoke the way people speak about things they've observed from a distance and assume are simpler than they are. Their lawyer caught up with him outside. I didn't hear the conversation, but I watched it. The confidence drained out of the hallway in the space of about 2 minutes. My lawyer fell into step beside me on the way to the parking lot. She waited until we were outside before she spoke. "You knew exactly what was in those documents," she said. "Yes," I said. She exhaled slowly. "You could have told me." "It wouldn't have changed what I decided," I said. She was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "In 3 years, I've never seen a client do that deliberately. I didn't do it to be clever," I told her. "I did it because I was tired of carrying it alone, and I needed them to understand what they were actually asking for." She nodded. Then she said, "Good luck." And she meant it. The drive home through Barrie that evening felt long and quiet in the way that spaces feel after something has finally shifted. I passed the street where the shop sat and didn't look. I turned on the radio and then turned it off again. By the time I reached home, my phone had already started to ring. It was Dana. She didn't say hello. She said, "Our lawyer says there's a personal guarantee on the lease." I said yes. She was quiet. "What does that mean?" "It means," I said, "that whoever owns the business is personally liable if the lease defaults. Not the business, the owner." Another silence. "Marcus didn't know that." "Neither did you," I said, "because neither of you asked." I heard her breathing. "When did you find out?" "When I took over the books," I said, 3 years ago." She didn't respond for a long moment. I let the silence sit where it needed to. Marcus called the following morning. His tone was different from anything I'd heard from him in years. Not hostile, not confident, careful, in the way that people are careful when they realize they've misjudged the weight of something they picked up without thinking. "Our lawyer went through everything last night," he said. "The HST remittances alone, I know," I said. He paused. "You've been doing all of that yourself?" "Every quarter," I said. He was quiet. "The supplier agreement with the renewal clause, the deferred maintenance on the back storage, the payroll remittances, you handled all of it?" "All of it," I said. He exhaled. "Why didn't you tell us?" "I did," I said. "You just weren't listening." That was the part he didn't argue with. Over the following weeks, reality settled in the way it always does, not dramatically but persistently. Marcus flew back to Calgary and managed things remotely, which is how he had always preferred to manage things. Dana took on more of the day-to-day, which was genuinely new for her. They called me with questions. Not accusatory questions, practical ones. Where was the account number for the commercial insurance? Who was the contact at the primary supplier? What was the process for the year-end inventory reconciliation? I answered what I could. I didn't take over. That was the line I had drawn for myself before the hearing, and I held it, not as punishment, as clarity. Their lawyer called my lawyer once, a professional call, measured in tone. He acknowledged that the transferred obligations had been fully disclosed in the documentation. He did not suggest any wrongdoing. He simply said that his clients had underestimated the scope and were seeking to understand the baseline administrative requirements. My lawyer relayed this to me and added, dryly, that this was the most gracious version of "we didn't read it" that she had encountered in some time. I laughed for the first time in months. A few weeks after the transfer, Marcus and I spoke again. The conversation was longer than any we'd had in years. He didn't apologize directly. What he said instead was, "I didn't understand what you were actually doing there. I think I told myself it was just retail, just a small shop." "I understand," I said. "It's easy to minimize what you're not watching closely." There was a pause. He said, "You kept that place solvent through 2 years of supply chain problems and a slow recovery from COVID. I know what the numbers look like now. I looked at the window in my kitchen and thought about the rosemary pot that used to sit there. I did what needed doing," I said. He said, "More than that. I think you kept it alive." That was as close to acknowledgement as we'd come, and it was enough for now. Dana changed more visibly. She had always been the one most likely to show what she was feeling, and what she was feeling now was something between embarrassment and genuine surprise. She called me one evening from the shop, after closing. "I'm looking at the filing cabinet," she said. "The one behind the register." "I know it," I said. She said, "It's color-coded." I said yes. She was quiet for a second. "I didn't know you did that." I said, "There's a lot I did that didn't announce itself." She said, "I know that now." There was a pause. She said, "I think I thought you were trying to take something from us." I said, "I know. I thought," she continued, "that you'd always been the one who wanted control, the one who liked being in charge." I let that sit for a moment. Then I said, "I was the one who showed up. That's not the same thing as wanting control. That's just what happens when everyone else leaves the room." She cried a little. I let her. My parents called together about 3 weeks after the transfer. My father spoke first, which was unusual. He was never comfortable on the phone, always preferred to say important things in person. But he called, And he said, "We should have been clearer with Marcus and Dana before any of this started." I said, "Yes, you should have." He was quiet. He said, "We trusted you because you were the one we saw working. And then we let other people tell us what that meant." My mother came on the line. Her voice was softer than my father's, always has been. She said, "I didn't know you'd taken on the personal guarantee." I said, "I know." She said, "That wasn't fair to you." I told her, "No, it wasn't. But I did it because I thought it was the right thing at the time." She said, "We should have asked more questions." I agreed with her. That was the most honest conversation we'd had in years. My lawyer sent me a brief message about 6 weeks after the hearing. One of her clients had asked her about a case involving a family business transfer, and she'd cited elements from mine without names. She said she thought I might like to know it had become a reference point for how to document ownership transition in a small business. I wrote back and said I was glad something useful had come out of it. She replied, "More than you know." I walked past the shop on a Saturday morning in February, about 4 months after the transfer. It was still called Bel Air Home Goods. The window display had changed. Marcus had ordered new fixtures before he flew back to Calgary, and Dana had set them up herself. The store was open, the lights were on. I stood on the sidewalk for a moment and felt something I hadn't expected to feel. Not grief, not bitterness, something closer to relief. The kind that comes when you put down something heavy and your arms stop shaking. I had carried that business the way you carry something that matters to you, carefully, quietly, without making a performance of the weight. Not because I was asked to, not because I expected recognition, but because I understood what would happen if I didn't. And when the moment came to let it go, I let it go cleanly. Without taking anything from it that wasn't mine. Without leaving anyone else worse than I found them. That's the part people don't always understand about letting go. It isn't defeat. It isn't giving up. It's deciding that your self-respect matters more than winning an argument with people who have already decided who you are. The truth doesn't need you to shout it. It has a way of making itself known when the right moment arrives. And when it does, you want to be the person who stayed steady while it happened. For anyone listening who has been the one in their family who shows up, the one who handles what others overlook, who carries what others don't know to ask about, I want you to hear this. Your contribution does not need to be invisible to be valid. You are allowed to stop carrying what isn't appreciated. You are allowed to name what you've done without apologizing for doing it. And you are allowed to hand something back to the people who wanted it, knowing exactly what they're about to learn. Ownership without responsibility is not ownership. It's just a word. The people in your life who mistake the two will eventually find that out on their own. You don't have to be there when they do. If this story resonated with you, take a moment to ask yourself which responsibilities in your own life belong to you by choice and which ones you've taken on simply because no one else would. There's a difference, and it matters. If you'd like to hear more stories about quiet strength, real consequences, and learning to stop shrinking, you're welcome here. Stay a while.